So, I'm going to present on the concept of records management within Microsoft Teams. And I know it says records and governance, but obviously when you're submitting for sessions like this, you don't know how long you're actually going to be able to stand up and talk about things. So effectively, to get it down to 20 minutes, what I've done is just thought I'd focus on the records management. I really hope that that's okay for people in the room. But it's a big subject. Now, just to introduce myself, I'm sure some of you probably know me already, but my name is Rob Bath. I'm a Microsoft 365 solutions architect, but I'm also run a practice for a company called Intelligy, who are based just outside of Heathrow, who provide end-to-end Microsoft 365 solutions. And in my other role, I'm volunteering as the digital director for the Information and Records Management Society. So effectively, I've got this sort of hybrid position where I've got one foot in the Microsoft 365 community and another foot very much firmly in the records management space. So hear both sides of the fence and each other's concerns about each other, if that makes sense. So I will be diving deeply into the records management, well, as deep as we can in 20 minutes into the records management in today's session. So, just like everyone else, I'd like to thank all of the sponsors that are here today, all of the premium sponsors. I'm not going to name them all, and also, of course, all of the other sponsors that we got at today's event, and just thank them because, frankly, without the sponsors funding events like this, we wouldn't all be able to come and enjoy ourselves and get free sandwiches at lunchtime. So I think it's quite important to at least mention them. Now, I don't know how many people in the room are familiar with records management as a concept, or those people on the other side of the fence, because very often records managers are not really empowered inside the organisation, and sometimes they have a very distant arm-length sort of relationship with IT or with digital. But at a very high level, what they're trying to do is they're trying to sort the wheat from the chaff. So a records manager is trying to make sure that they keep the content that's absolutely essential for the organisation to retain. And that content could be obviously things such as content that has this historical value that you want to archive, that you want to retain almost indefinitely. When I was over recently in Seattle, I saw Bill Gates' business card from the very first business card that he put together. You can probably imagine that you want to keep some of these sort of things for future use. But it's not just about future archival, you're also talking about things that are very important information for the organisation to ensure that they're retaining. So, for example, imagine you get some people inside your organisation drilling through a wall and they hit some asbestos. You need to keep all of the information about that event because in 50 years' time, one of those people could come back with a lung condition and you need to prove innocence, I'm hoping, from that content. But it's not just about one side of the story. It's also, records managers are also trying to ensure timely deletion of content. So you can probably imagine certain types of content, it's absolutely essential that the organisation is removing on a timely basis. At this, let's give some examples. Things like, we called it ROT, so redundant, obsolete and trivial content. It's probably about 60-70% of all of the content in almost all organisations. Frankly, after 18 months or so, really has no value. And if you just leave it hanging around inside your tenant, you're effectively just clogging up your search results. It's probably the best way of phrasing it. So getting rid of all of that's really powerful. But in addition to the ROT, there's other bits of information that I'm sure you're all familiar with that we've got to get rid of. Things such as, let's say you've run a campaign and you've been recruiting some people into your organisation, all of the unsuccessful applicants, you've got to be removing their CVs and making sure that they're deleted. It's because you have no legitimate reason to retain them under GDPR. Anyway, I don't want to dwell on what is records management too much. Inside Microsoft 365, I'm sure many of you are already aware that current capabilities for retention are provided by what another speaker referred to as the gruesome twosome, the retention policy and the retention label. I'm sure many of you in this room, are people in this room already using these? Are people familiar with retention policies and labels? Already using them at a high level? So, I'll dive in, I'll just give you an overview of what they are. So, again, in 20 minutes I can't go into all the details, but the retention policy is effectively, the best way of imagining it, it's a broad brush, broad brush approach to retention, or don't. in Microsoft 365. So you apply the retention policy to a very broad, sweeping set of information, and it doesn't have individual fidelity. Now, what you do is you set up your retention policies and you give them a duration for how long they're applying retention to the content, and you also have an activity at the end of retention. And with the retention policy, there are two activities that you've got available to you. You can either choose to automatically destroy the content at the end of retention, or effectively you can choose to do nothing, which sounds ridiculous when you actually look and see a frown. Doing nothing is slightly better than it sounds out of the box, because what it allows you to do is, after the end of the retention period, any user who clicks that delete button, the file is not retained. It will allow it to delete. So it is, yeah, I thought the same when I first read it. Doing nothing doesn't seem like a great solution. But with the retention policy, one of the things to bear in mind is it's hidden behind the scenes. The end user doesn't see the retention policy. It's almost completely invisible. They don't realise that their content is subject to retention. Now, the way that it's applied, the reason I describe it as a broad brush approach, is effectively because you're applying it to a whole large area, and all of the content in that area is subject to the same retention. So, for example, if you applied it to a SharePoint site, all of the content, whether we're talking list items or library items, all of it is subject to the same retention. You apply it to an inbox, and you can probably imagine exactly the same thing, whether it's the invite to the Christmas party or whether it's the major policy decision, it's all subject to the same retention behind the scenes. Retention labels. Now, retention labels work in a slightly different way. They're classified. You're applying them to individual items. So as you can probably imagine with the retention label, you've got a much more flexibility to make sure that each individual piece of content is appropriately managed. Very much like retention policies, with the retention label, what you're doing is you're creating a duration for the retention period, and then you have an activity at the end of retention. Now those activities, you'll notice again we've got destroy and do nothing, the same exact two, but we've also added a third. If you've got either an E5 license or E3 plus one of the compliance bolt-ons, you've got the ability to invoke a disposition review at the end of retention to actually have a look at that file and see, is this something we do want to delete? Is this something we need to preserve for longer? Now, the way that this works is effectively when you're pushing out the retention labels to different parts of the content across your tenancy, what you do is you create something called a label policy. The label policy is a grouping of retention labels. Now this is not to be confused with the concept of a retention policy. The label policy is the grouping. I wish there were different names, but it's almost like there's roulette with the names of sort of labels and policies and retention, and in this case I'm talking about the label policy. So to try and explain what that means, you've created what is quite a large, potentially large file plan of different labels across your organisation. But in an individual part of your tenancy, let's take this office refurb site, you're only seeing a subset of those labels available. So you can imagine organisations that have different types of content and different sort of context that they're working in, you'd be able to hone in and only give users a smaller subset of those labels to pick from. And the way that that renders inside the SharePoint site is the retention label is something you can actually pick as metadata. Again, you can imagine the same thing happens in Outlook. You can actually tag individual files, individual emails as metadata. There are various other differences between the two, but I can't go into all of them. One of the key ones, I guess, is that the retention label, there are various variants of it, one of which allows you to lock the file and prevent any changes. So there's more flexibility there. Now, let's dive into Teams, because obviously this is focusing more on Teams, but I had to give you a generic introduction to retention before I got there. Now, I'm sure everyone in the room is very familiar with Teams. I don't need to explain anything about Teams really, but we all know it's a client application that is rendering information from across different parts of the tenancy. And those aspects of Teams, the telephony aspects that have come across from Skype for Business, the posts, the chats, the channel messages, all of those abilities that are really coming from Skype for Business, behind the scenes, a copy of all of those chats and channel messages being retained inside Exchange. So there's the substrat holds folder inside Exchange, for any of you who happen to be blundering through the back end of Exchange looking for it, and that's stored inside everyone's inbox. It's also stored inside the group inbox. So of course, if you're talking about a channel message, you'll see the copies of the channel messages stored in the group inbox. If it happens to be a one-to-one private chat, it's in your own personal inbox, stored in the substrat holds folder. Now, that is where retention is applied. That is a copy. That's not what you're seeing actually in the Teams interface. It's a copy of those chats, and that's where you're applying the retention to. Whereas, as you can probably imagine, SharePoint is at the back end behind the files, and it's the retention that you apply to the SharePoint site that's actually protecting the files that are stored in Microsoft Teams. And this split, the reason I'm dwelling on it is it explains how you're actually applying retention, the abilities you've got in those specific areas. So in the concept of channel messages and in one-to-one chat, etc., and in private channels, all you've got for the posts and the chats is the retention policy. And you've got the ability for, and again, because this is the broad brush approach, you've got the ability to say all of the one-to-one personal chats that an individual is undertaking are subject to the same retention. Again, irrespective of the conversation, the actual purpose or the value of that conversation. And when it comes to channel posts, you're applying it at a team level. So all of the channels in a team, all of the posts that happen to be in those channels would be subject to the same retention. Now, strangely, the private channels works in a bit of a different way. If I was speaking in front of you a year ago, private channels weren't subject to retention. You couldn't apply retention to them. But Microsoft has added retention support to private channels over the last 12 months. And effectively, the way they've done it is by user, which I find a bit interesting because effectively the content, the post, if you like, on a private channel wall, really it's down to who's posting them. So different people having a conversation in a private channel wall could be subject to different retentions applied to different users. Very confusing. I have no idea why it's been architected that way. Moving across to the SharePoint side, as you can imagine, you've got the power of both the retention policy and the retention label. So with the retention policy, you can apply it at the whole site level, so all of the content in the site, whereas with the retention labels, you have the collection of retention labels where you can classify each file individually as you choose to do so. There's various automated ways of applying retention labels as well, but I won't go into all of them. I would suggest that in most scenarios, you probably want to start thinking about having the retention labels almost applied to, say, the folders and the libraries, certainly the folders that are related to channels.
What takes precedence then, the policy or the label?
Well, you can imagine that you can actually have multiple retention policies and up to one. You can only have one retention label all kick in at once, so there could be multiple different things that are applied. And Microsoft has some principles of retention. There's 4 principles of retention. Don't have them in the slides to show you, but effectively those govern the precedence. Typically, the rules mean that the longest retention, I'm doing this from memory, the longest retention will always win. So retention will always beat deletion, and the longest retention period will always win. And the third rule is effectively that retention labels will always beat out a retention policy. So it works in, the rules support certain activities really well. So for example, if you had a retention policy in OneDrive that's auto-deleting after 18 months, if you had retention labels to override that, that would be perfectly fine. You could allow the retention, longer retention labels to override a shorter retention deletion policy, if that makes sense.
The flip side wouldn't work though.
The other way doesn't work. So imagine you've got a finance site with the default retention 7 years, and you've also got retention labels that you want for GDPR, say to delete down content. Doesn't work that way. You need to make sure that there isn't a clash in some scenarios. You got it.
Well, it's interesting because I've seen a few MSPs that have done things like retention policy, retain everything for 10 years
Yes.
as a backup. So it's
What happens is all of those files, all of the chats, etc., will be caught behind the scenes, and you cannot delete them when they're behind the scenes. They fall into, in SharePoint, it's the preservation hold library, and in Outlook, it is the substrat holds, and there is no ability to delete content from that. It's retained indefinitely. So you can probably imagine, let's say you see something with credit card details. If it is subject to retention, when you hit delete, it's caught, and it's still something that you effectively have and possess as an organisation. So you've got to be really careful with GDPR compliance when you're applying retention to content. So, first thing that this concept draws out to me is effectively that the concept that because you've got some things that are protected inside Outlook and the Exchange and some things that are protected inside SharePoint, you can probably imagine that it's a bit disjointed in terms of the retention story. A government department about 6 months ago approached me and said, how do we back up the whole of this team? And we've got a single team that all of our COVID response is in. We want to back that up and send it to the National Archives. How do we apply that retention to it? And the answer is it's really complicated because it's in different places, and actually, even if you export it and try and merge it together, effectively you can't use Teams as a medium for sort of collective retention. You're thinking about individual files. And the second thing that really jumps out to me is that, and this is probably apparent to everyone, that if you want to apply retention in Microsoft Teams, you absolutely need to control the creation of those teams. So whether you're talking about a static structure of teams, or whether you're talking more likely dynamic processes around the request and provisioning of teams, you need to get the retention baked in at that time. You probably also need to start considering the intercepting of change within the teams. So new channels being created, new private channels especially, will be outside of the scope of retention unless they're intercepted and handled, if you like, when they're created. Now, this all probably leads to a question of should we even be using records management in Teams? And I'm not going to give you a straight answer to this because I'm a consultant and consultants can't ever say yes or no. But effectively, I can argue this both ways because there's almost two models that I'm seeing out there in real world in organisations. Some organisations are seeing almost a transfer of content outside of the team at the end of life into a longer term retention capability, perhaps in SharePoint elsewhere. Other organisations are more considering that Teams is everything. That a team doesn't necessarily have an endpoint. It could be departmental, for example, and so they want to undertake retention inside Teams. And I personally think that we haven't yet got to a point where it's clear which of those two cycles is preferable. But let me give you one example which I think is interesting. Imagine that guy drilling through the wall and hitting asbestos again. And imagine your files relating to that incident are stored inside a team. Now imagine that after 40 years, he comes knocking through the door. What's the chances that the same people who were members of the team 40 years ago, if any of them are still going to be members of that team, put aside whether or not Teams will be here in 40 years, but imagine, having who is going to be left? You could end up in a situation where all of the content in the team is deleted down because it's all subject to retention and deleted when it hits its retention, the end of retention. And you might end up with one or two files that effectively are keeping the team preserved, keeping the SharePoint site alive, but yet no one's got access to it apart from your admins. Is that really an effective way of storing and retaining information, especially if it's information that you would need to share more widely? Because no one might be aware that information even exists. So sometimes it might be better to transfer your content out of Teams rather than retain everything in Teams. But yet, different organisations are choosing different approaches to this question. And I don't think anyone's got a sensible answer at this point. It's mostly because Teams is amazing for collaboration, and I think we can probably all agree with that. I can't use anything but Teams for collaboration, but it probably needs, behind the scenes, it's not being designed really for information governance. Now, I don't know if I've got time. I haven't actually looked at the clock. I probably should. Just check. Yeah, I've got a minute left. That's very fast, but we'll try. I'm mentioning adaptive scopes just because it's brand new records management capability. I don't know if any of you have heard of adaptive scopes or seen anything about it, but it's coming to your tenancy on Monday. So timing, I think, is pretty prompt, or at least that's what the compliance team told me the other day when I was speaking to them. So, announced back in March, the idea of an adaptive scope is it really gives you dynamic application of retention. So let me try and explain. If I go back to the slide that I showed you before around retention policies, but bear in mind that while I'm showing you retention policies, this also works for label policies, which are the grouping of retention labels. Let's simplify this and just focus in on one part of that story. Let's look at the one-to-one personal chat that Lara here is undertaking. And imagine a scenario that up until Monday, the way of applying a retention policy to Lara's one-to-one chat, but not to other employees, would be that you'd have to individually name Lara. You have to say, hey, Lara's something special about what was about Lara, we need to retain her chat for a different duration. But we all know that underneath the scenes we've got a lot more information in 0AD about who Lara is, and this is where the adaptive scope comes in. Because actually the reason that we want to apply the financial retention policy to her chat is because she's in the payroll team. So you can probably imagine with adaptive scopes, once they hit your tenancy, you've got the ability to now make effectively dynamic retention policies or groups of retention labels with the label policies. And the idea is you set up a rule a bit like this where you can say, actually, the AD property is equal to payroll, therefore it's applied to Lara. And the reason why this is cool, the reason why I love this, is effectively because it handles change. You can imagine if Ben leaves the legal team and joins the payroll team, the rule kicks in automatically without you ever having to do anything for Ben. And while I've just been mentioning user attributes, there's a whole bunch of other attributes that are supported, including custom attributes. So it's not just limited to offices and departments, etc. And while I've been mentioning Teams chat, as you can probably imagine, there's a whole bunch of other places in Microsoft 365 that are focused on the user. So really, you're looking at being able to use any of these attributes to apply retention dynamically to any of these parts, any of these workloads inside Microsoft 365. But of course, these are not, the user isn't the only object, if you like, for want of a better word, that happens to have attributes. The SharePoint site also has custom attributes, including the property bag. And as you can probably imagine, you can apply, dynamically apply retention based upon metadata that's appended to the SharePoint site to SharePoint sites. So you could almost have a story where if the SharePoint site changes its purpose, you could have dynamically changing retention applied to it. Likewise, the Microsoft 365 group extends that even further, where there's attributes on the group itself that can automatically apply retention to different objects, different workloads in Microsoft 365. So, I'll wrap up. I think you've all heard enough, and I've probably overrun by a minute or two. But I hope it's been of some use to some of you. So, I'm meant to talk about the drinks at 5:30 in the atrium and expo hall, so please, do pop along there. And also the charity quiz at 6:30, which you need to register for on the website. So please do all, attend. Thank you for your time. Any questions before we do wrap up? No, that's probably perfect. Thank you.